So as we start this unit, we're going to start by looking at an overview of statistics. So we're going to look at what is called a grouped frequency distribution. A grouped frequency distribution is a chart, and the purpose of setting up that chart is to organize a data set. So if you consider a group of, say, 100 numbers forming a data set, you would want to be able to organize that data so that you can draw conclusions or make predictions. It's very difficult to see what is happening with a data set if you're only looking at a set of numbers. So a grouped frequency distribution is going to be something that we're going to make that will allow us to draw those conclusions and answer those questions. So a group frequency distribution is going to contain columns for class limits, class boundaries, for midpoints, and for frequency. So we're going to go ahead and look at an example and talk about how we set up this grouped frequency distribution. So we have a data set, and we're told to make a frequency distribution using 5 classes. So there are a couple of things that we need to do before we can get started setting up the distribution. The first thing that we need to do is we need to calculate what is called the range of the data set. When we're talking about the range of a data set, we're talking about the highest value minus the lowest value. Now, it's very important that when you select your highest and your lowest values, that you select those values correctly. So as I look through my data set, I can see that the highest value is 635 and the lowest value is 6. And again, you want to be certain that you have selected the highest and the lowest values correctly. So I'm going to take 635 and I'm going to subtract 6. Which is going to give me 629. So basically what this says is that my data set spans a possible 629 values. The second thing that I want to do is I want to calculate what is called the class width. I'm going to calculate the class width because that's going to tell me how big to make each of the classes in the frequency distribution. So to calculate the class width, we're going to take the range that we just found and we're going to divide it by the number of classes. So our range is 629 and the problem told me to use 5 classes, so I'm going to divide by 5. So 629 divided by 5 gives me 125.8. Now, there are 2 things that we want to consider as we're doing the class width. The first of those is that we really would rather not work with the decimal. So I'm going to go ahead and tell myself that I want to round that number up. Now, rounding up is a little different than rounding off. So basically what we're saying is that regardless of what the decimal is, we're going to bump it up to the next whole number. And not only that, but we want to bump it up to the next odd number. So I'm going to make myself a note here that I want to round up to the next odd number. And the reason why is that when we go to do our calculations for columns like the midpoints, having our width odd makes those calculations a little easier. So this 125.6 or 125.8, I'm going to bump to 126, but 126 is not odd, and so I'm going to keep bumping, and I'm going to bump to 127. Okay, so now we're ready to begin setting up our class limits. So when I set up my class limits, I'm going to start with the smallest value in the class, which would be 6. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to take that 127 that we just came up with for the width, and I'm going to add it to 6. So I'm going to say 127 plus 6, and that's going to give me 133. That 133 is going to start my second class. I'm then going to do it again. I'm going to take the 133 and I'm going to add the width. So I'm adding 127. So 133 plus 127 gives me 260. That becomes the start of the third class. Then I'm going to do it again. So every time you move from one class to the next, you're going to be adding this 127. All right, so 260 plus 127 gives me 387. And then 387 plus 127 gives me 514. And then I'm going to add 127 one more time to give me 641, and I'm going to tack that on at the end, and you'll see why in just a second. Okay, so again, just to kind of sum that up, we're going to start with our lowest value, which is 6, and we're going to add our width over and over and over again until we complete the left-hand side of that column. We're now going to work on the right-hand side of the column. So what I want to do here is I want to consider the fact that my classes need to be continuous in that they need to move from 6 until the end. So if the second class starts at 133, then the first class needed to have ended at 132. If the third class starts at 260, the second class should have ended at 259. If our fourth class starts at 387, the third class ends at 386. If our next class starts at 514, the previous class ended at 513. And finally, if this last number that we wrote down for a quote, a sixth class that we really didn't need, if that one ends at 641, the fifth class ends at 640. So you can see that I used that extra number so that I would know where to stop on the previous class. All right, so that is actually the hardest part of the process. All right, so now we're ready to move on and look at our boundaries. So our boundaries are going to sort of fill in the gaps between the classes. If you note that the first class goes from 6 to 132, and then the next class starts at 133. And so there's this little gap, it's decimals, but there's a little gap between 132 and 133. The purpose of the boundaries is to fill in that gap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the right-hand numbers first, and I'm going to add a little bit to them. So essentially, I'm going to take that 132 and I'm going to add a 0.5 on the end. And I'm going to do that for all 5 of those numbers. So the next one will be 259. And I'm going to put a 0.5 on the end of that. So what I'm doing when doing this is I'm making these values just a little bit more. So we'll have 386.5. We'll have 513.5. We will have 640.5. And again, that is taking the right-hand numbers and increasing those numbers by just a little bit, by the 0.5. And boundaries essentially always end in a 0.5. So now I'm going to work on the left-hand side. So I'm going to take this 6 and I'm going to go a little less than that. So a little bit less than 6 is going to be 5. And remember that all your boundaries end in a 0.5. My next one is 133, so a little bit less would be 132. And again, we're going to end it in a 0.5. 260, a little bit less, would be 259, ending it in a 0.5. 387 would be 386, ending it in a 0.5. And finally, 514, a little bit less, would be 513, and we'll end it in a 0.5. And so that will complete the boundaries for the second column. For the midpoints, what we want to do is we want to essentially find the middle number in each class. So in order to do that, I'm going to take, for the first class, I'm going to take the two numbers, the 6 and the 132, and I'm going to average them. So I'm going to add them together and divide by 2. So 6 and 132 makes 138 divided by 2. 138 divided by 2 gives me 69. For my next midpoint, I'm going to do 133 plus 259 and divide by 2. So 133 plus 259 is 392. Divide it by 2 and we get 196. All right, so I'm going to go ahead very quickly and just write in the other midpoints, but you can do them all the same way. The next one you should get 323, then 450, and then 577. All right, the last thing that we need to do is the frequency column. So the frequency means that we're going to count the number of values that occur in each class. So for the first class, from 6 to 132, I'm going to count the number of values that are between 6 and 132. I would recommend that you cross them off as you count them. So I would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. And I'm just doing a quick double check. All right, so there are 16 numbers in my list that are between 6 and 132. Now let's look at the numbers that are between 133 and 259. So that would be this one, and this one. So we have 3 values that are between 133 and 259. We don't have any values in the data set between 260 and 386, so I'll put a 0. We don't have any values between 387 and 513, so I'm also going to put a 0 there. I have one remaining value, 635, and that's going to fall in between 514 and 640. So I'll have a 1 in the last row. And so that completes the steps to completing a grouped frequency distribution.